So you mentioned before that you knew strictly in your school years the difference between private talk and public talk. And I'm wondering because I remember you saying that your parents were not political, they were apolitical, you said. So where do these whispers start coming from? How do you start to figure out as as your mind starts to open up that this is all sort of fictitious and you're living in an
Well,
imaginary.
apolitical in that context meant about my parents to a different degree. My mother probably was not. She didn't think that that was something within our power to change in any kind of way. So why bother even thinking about it? And she didn't. My father was more so apolitical. Meant political though, because you either you're vocally for, or if you're apolitical,
You're against.
it's a famous Soviet slogan, which was always kind of paramount in every Soviet's mind, was constantly repeated. And so, he who is not with us is against us, very simply. So he who is not on our side is our enemy. But obviously, they just knew that they couldn't open their mouth in public. That's all. But at night, my father constantly tried to listen to those foreign radio stations in Russian, which were all jammed. I don't know if I mentioned that, but this KGB had high frequency kind of installations that jammed certain radio stations, so you couldn't really. So I still remember late at night, because at night was when the air was clear and the KGB was less. And it also very much depended on the neighborhood. In big cities, it was ferocious. But if you went out of big city, then nobody cared there. So you could listen there, but then nobody was there. So
What would you
my
hear?
father would constantly trying to listen to the Voice of America or the BBC in Russian, or Die Deutsche Welle, the German wave in Russian, and it just depended on which reception was. I remember from my room and our apartment listening to that, and periodically through that cosmic howling and this kind of blizzard noises, just suddenly there is the kind of breaking through it, this kind of poisonous, kind of very uh, precisely articulating and therefore sounding foreign and un-Russian, even though those were not native Russian speakers, but they articulated in a non-Russian way somehow. So those voices coming from the other side of the world or from the moon or something like that. So, I think that up until a certain point, we were all, at least friends of mine, we were all kind of ironic about all of that, but we had absolutely no intention of being against, because that would ruin our. We just went with the flow. We were just, so we live in this kind of country, okay. But and like I said, we were members of the young community first, because actually you had to be, like 99.9% of the people in high school were, because without that you would have much more difficult time getting into college. And for males, that had very simple, serious implications, because if by age 18 you're not in college, as I may have mentioned, you're going to be conscripted into the army, which was something that you really wanted to avoid,
Mhm.
for a large variety of reasons. And so we all sort of like went with the flow. And since all the kind of artistic activities also in high school and early in college, they were all kind of, you know, were in line with the Young Communist League kind of activities. It's like almost like everything that was sponsored by the Young Communist League. So summer construction brigades that you had to participate in the summer, all kinds of student theater, everything somehow had to have an ideological underpinning. It didn't have to manifest itself in the context on the content of the work, but it was known that everything took place in. It's like, imagine, like, let's say Quebec Writers Federation is the branch of I don't know, Canada Communist Union or something like that, right? It's just like so that's so
There's always an
tonight
agenda.
tonight is at the library is the reading of the Quebec Communist Union writers. Who the hell cares? It'll be Dave McGimsey and and me and whoever. Who cares? It's just that everything is sponsored by them. That's all. So I don't know. Actually, I do remember precisely the moment when it occurred to me. I realized much. So I participated in all of those, and moreover, when we went to the summer construction brigades, which is basically you have to do something. You had to do something in the summer as a college student. So there were brigades that were sent essentially like cheap labor. Working in the countryside, uh, picking like potatoes or building some cheap like very just stables or just or uh, you know some kind of a collective farm related activities, because everybody in the countryside essentially kolkhozniks, they were just dead drunk. So anyways, so I went there in the capacity of a cultural organizer because I was so active in student theater, writing, and so forth. But that was also carried like young communist league connotations. It was called a commissar. I was someone responsible for the cultural activities. Was called a commissar, right? So, which is a very militaristic and communist kind of term. But I remember distinctly, yeah, how for the first time I realized that I've gone very within myself, that I've gone far uh, along the way of becoming anti-Soviet element, and that horrified me.
How old were you when that?
Well, I was. It was actually immediately after I got accepted in college. Um, some things actually happened before that. When I was in 10th grade, there was a classmate of mine a girl who liked me, and she wrote me notes periodically, and she was daughter of someone who went to college with my mother, so that's how they knew. And so at one point, I remember. Um, uh, I was also in high school. I was a so-called informator. In other words, as somebody who always had this ability to speak off the cuff and always reading lots of newspapers, just very curious about what happens outside the Soviet Union, and the only way to know was to read like Soviet political, of course, magazines like Abroad, which was like a compilation of mainly communist, publications from the United States, France, UK, and so forth. So I would get up every week for like 40 minutes and so forth, and just off the cuff, I would just tell people what's happening in the world, and in Vietnam, and all of it from very Soviet perspective, because I didn't have any other perspective really. And also, it was pretty kind of conformist of me too, just but we we saw nothing wrong with it. And now I'm kind of surprised how I saw nothing wrong with it, but I was 16. And then I remember at one point, sort of like lightheartedly or like in passing, mentioning that the Jewish Defense League in New York blew up the office of the impresario Sol Yurok, who invited Soviet ballet to the United States as a protest against the treatment of Soviet Jews, which were just harassed and not allowed out of the country and so forth. Jewish Defense League was a very militant organization headed by Rabbi Meir Kahane and so forth. I knew nothing about that. I didn't feel myself Jewish in any way, although, of course, I knew that I was Jewish. And by that point, I already got my Soviet passport at the age of 16, where it said that I was Jewish. But I mentioned that. And then I came home, and then I got a phone call from that girl, and and I thought, and she said, I very much liked your political information. And I said, well, thank you. Just, but she was being sardonic. She said, yeah, it's wonderful that you're a Jew, just spreading this anti-Semitic crap. And then she hung up, and I was stunned because it never even occurred to me. But then at some point in 10th grade, shortly thereafter, she just disappeared. She disappeared. She stopped coming to class, and we couldn't. Her friends didn't know, the friends who brought her notes to me, for instance. They didn't know anything about her. What happened to her? Our teacher, classroom teacher, wouldn't know. Principal would not even deign respond. We know. Just she just disappeared. But my mother knew, and at some point she told me that when I pressed, "Oh, but that's a big, big secret." But they left for Israel, and they immigrated to Israel. And that was very early years of the immigration of Jews from the Soviet Union. Jews were the only category of people allowed to leave the Soviet Union legally, under the false pretext of reunification with their relatives in Israel. But she did go to Israel with her parents, not in the United States. And so I was stunned by that, and also the very thought that it could be done. And I really, at that moment, realized that, oh my God, if only could leave the Soviet Union, that would be so amazing. So that's what I told my parents. And I still remember, like in the dark of night, my father kind of laughing, kind of rueful, and said, "Look, forget about it. It's never going to happen." So why never? Because that word never is really grating to me. And it would be anyone to at the age of 16, you know? And so, well, never, because the kind of work I do, right? And the kind of clearance that I have, right? So, they would never let anyone in our family out the country just because because of the work that I do and all the clearance that I managed to have accumulated and so forth. So I was crushed by that.
So he was too important to be let go.
Yeah, he was the leading designer of Soviet submarine protection against the electromagnetic, just radiation that enabled American radars and sonars to detect Soviet submarines. So of course it was, it was he was full of super secret information about Soviet submarines. As a footnote, many years later, when the Soviet Union fell apart and they started publishing in translation all kinds of American and foreign literature, lots of it crap and crappy translations. But I remember him like looking through Tom Clancy's Hunt for the Red October, and at some points he was just laughing. This is ridiculous. But at some points he would get, "Oh my God, how did he know that?" Because that was supposed to be like super, super secret information about Soviet submarine. But Tom Clancy, I mean, it was
Mhm.
none of those secrets were all that secret.
It was public knowledge
It
across the sea.
well, Tom Clancy employed a bunch of researchers, of course, but yeah, it could be found. It was not common knowledge to a layperson because it was heavily, scientific, like military stuff, Navy. But Tom Clancy knew.
Wow.
And so, but of course, my father never was allowed. He was invited to different international conference, but it was never even a question that he would ever be able to travel abroad while the Soviet Union existed. So I remember being crushed by that, and but that the thought had been planted, and so shortly thereafter, I was accepted to Leningrad Shipbuilding University. I don't know if I don't remember if I told the story of how I ended up there.
Well, you said that you just felt compelled to do something mechanical, something engineering.
No, I didn't feel to do anything in.
Not because you wanted to, but
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that was because essentially I wanted and had the right to go without exams into philology department at Leningrad University as one of the winners of Literary Olympics. I'm just giving a very abridged version because I remember talking to somebody about that, and it's kind of repeating myself. And my parents, yeah, and so I was, it was a literary contest, just citywide, and there were like hundreds of thousands of, or however many. Leningrad was a huge city at that point already, with well over 4 million people. So tens of thousands. I don't know, high school kids participating and so forth. And so I was a finalist and one of the winners. And so, as one of the winners, I had the right of entering philology department without entrance exams, and there were entrance exams, of course, in the Soviet Union. But my parents had told me like, forget about it. It's not going to happen. I said, well, why not? Well, just forget about it. Okay, it's not going to happen. And so it's a good thing that the entrance exams at the university, or just generally admissions to the university philology department, any humanities field, was like a month in advance of exams to, let's say, Leningrad Shipbuilding University, which was late August, because uh, at some point I was i- i- invited by two very well-meaning older gentlemen, members of the Leningrad University party committee, Communist Party committee, who offered me tea, and we had a very like friendly conversation, suggesting like, look, uh, great that you have literary talent. We haven't read because we don't particularly read, but that stuff. But we kind of were curious, fleetingly, as to why you chose to write at the final stage, at the final. You were all at the in one auditorium and you had to write like for 6 hours a composition. We were kind of curious as to why you chose to write an American writer, like we don't have enough Russian writers to write about. And I was writing about just basically comparison between the Robert Van Warren's All the King's Men and the Soviet TV series based on that, and the Russian translation of All the King's Men. And of course, it was starkly the TV series was very much anti-American. Of course, but All the King's Men is Robert Penn Warren's famous novel based on the true story of the Huey Long, or Kingfish. Huey Long, the former governor of Louisiana, who was larger than life character and was beginning to run for president, and then he was killed by brother of his mistress and so forth. So that's the story. And he was a populist Democrat. He was basically a Donald Trump, but much more vicious in ways. He was Louisiana kind of, just kind of. He's a racist and everything, but he was hugely popular person. Anyways, so and then they said, well, look, you have the right to enter, to become a student here, to enroll, but based on our powers of prediction, we can foresee that you probably will flunk the first. After the first semester, you'll be kicked out for poor grades. Odd as it may sound, given that you always got the best grades and so forth, but nonetheless, that's you probably will get very bad grades, and then you will be, just sort of like expelled, and then you'll have to ask yourself and wonder what your parents would think about it, because after that you'll have to go to the army, obviously. Do you really want that to happen?
So they saw you almost as a threat, I
Well,
would
they didn't
say.
say it. They said we can tell that you won't like our, and they use that word, microclimate, and said that we only have people like you, daughter of Dimshits. Dimshits was a minister of construction in the Soviet Union. Dimshits is a very Jewish last name. In other words, they were saying that they don't want Jews here. There are no Jews here, and Jews were not welcome in any humanities in any institutions of higher learning. So my parents were right. So shortly after that, they were in our high school. They were already circulating a piece of paper with the short list of institutions of higher learning in Leningrad, where Jews were allowed. So uh, prior to that, prior to my graduation, shortly, uh, the uh, the main person in Leningrad and the surrounding area, man named Grigory Romanov, member of the Politburo and member of the head of the Communist Party, in other words, in Leningrad, and it's a disgusting person, very openly and proudly anti-Semitic, just a horrendous, uh, ugly, ugly kind of human being whose daughter's wedding took place in the Hermitage, where the drunken guests basically demolished 15th century China, those kind of things, and so. Yeah, and so he went at the conference of all the presidents or rectors, and they're called of institutions of higher learning in Leningrad, and there were lots of. They were called institutes, not universities, but there were many, and he warned them that, look, you are being lax and you're being too lenient and dangerously reckless in accepting uh, students who potentially might end up in the countries that are our enemies, and they will use our best in the world free Soviet education against us. He didn't specify the country, but he said, well, he didn't specify what kind of student, but he said, well, for instance, they could end up in Israel. And that was the years of opening of the Jewish immigration. So it was not difficult to figure out who he had in mind. And so shortly after that, we had a list of colleges that would accept Jews, and that was not a long list. And since my father was such a prominent figure in submarines, and he was part-time teaching at that university, part-time he was lecturing there when they invited him and so forth. So yeah, that's the one I applied to. And since I had always been fairly good at math and physics also, I didn't mind them at all. I just was not my passion, but I was good at that also, rather. So, I was accepted. And then before the beginning of the school year, first the freshman year, all the Soviet students, or at least in Leningrad, but I think all over the Soviet Union, were sent into the countryside for the whole month of September to do their agricultural duty, which is to say to pick up like the late fall potatoes, So we were sent again because the agricultural workers were not coping themselves, and essentially they were just and so yeah, the incoming class of uh, was sent 300 kilometers due north of Leningrad in the wilderness, basically, and so 20 or 30 of us. There are many locations to where groups of students were sent from our incoming class of many hundreds, but we were like specifically our faculty, our department, right, our specifics major and so forth. So we were all split. And my major was submarines, and it was actually kind of secret and so forth. So we were mainly electromagnetic fields. So our group was sent there, and that's where the connection with this place starts, because that was like 3 days before the opening game of the Soviet Union and Canada. You remember that, right? 1970.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So um, and of course, when you were, we didn't know anything at all except that Canadian professionals were from another world. So we were like making bets, like, are we going to lose like 50-0 or like 100-0? Because we had no idea. Canadian professionals, for all we'd never seen one.
Mm.
So, but we'd heard those names, Bobby Orr, just Bobby Hall, Phil Esposito. Had heard those names, but we'd never seen them, and they were never shown on Soviet television. And so who knows what the hell they could do? They, for all we knew, they could just fly parallel to the ice. Just just just
They had superpowers.
yeah, they just like super people and so forth. So we had no idea, and but we had no place to watch that game. So as a result of very complex machinations and kind of drunken, like kind of escapades and so forth, but we managed to find a place on the outskirts of that godforsaken, mud-spattered village, God knows where. 300 kilometers north of Leningrad. It's not, it's far up north, and it's third world going on fourth world. All right. But there was a old drunken woman who had a black and white TV like this size, the size of this laptop screen, um, and she agreed for like a barrel of beer, which we won as a result from the local store, as a result of our singing for the local, agricultural workers, drunkenly our student songs. So we gave her that beer, and she allowed us, like 15 or 16 of us, all the boys. Girls in our group were not particularly, and we couldn't even go, how can you not be interested? It's just bizarre. Anyway, so that was the time when, when if somebody had told us then, like, look, you're going to forfeit your first whole year of college, but you will get to watch this game, or you'll be like getting all the A's from now on till the end of your college, but you won't watch it. So definitely, let's forfeit the first year of college, definitely, because it seemed that important, that there's just this when you're that young, and so the thought of not being able to watch that game was inconceivable. It was shown in the Soviet Union late at night, but the following day, because of the time differential of 8 hours.
Right.
So when it started in Montreal, when it started like what, at 8 or 9 o'clock, it was 8 hours ahead. So it was 5 in the morning, 4 or 5 in the morning. So it was shown late at night, but not that late the following day. But nobody in Soviet Union knew the result. we suspect there were some people who did, who were involved in it, but it was not in the newspapers and it was not on the radio, and there were no newspapers anyways in that
So it
godforsaken.
was like you were watching it live.
Yeah,
Almost. Yeah.
yeah, it was totally like watching it live.
Mm.
So somewhere out there, that game had already happened, and maybe the score was 77-0 Canadians, but we didn't know any of that. And so we started watching that game, and we kind of uh, we had lots of cheap. That was all they was selling there in local store, vodka, cheap vodka. That is, if somebody here would open and just sniff that vodka, just people would faint, because you open that vodka, that local vodka, and and dogs on the other side of the lake start howling. Basically, just it was the important thing was not to sniff at it, just um, uh, and so we kind of resolved to have a shot every time we score a goal, which we knew was not going to happen. And so very quickly that game started, and immediately we were 2-0 behind, right? We
Right.
just that was an onslaught, and we said, yeah, it's going to be like that. And then this Soviet commentator, like announcer Mikhail Iossel, the only one who did all the international games, he was just shouting like constantly, if that's their hockey, we don't need that hockey. Because Phyllis was doing that, just showing like to the goalie, this kind of thing. And
Yeah.
they were like super physical, they of course, they were
Right.
just very, very, very rough. Yeah. So, but then suddenly Soviets started scoring, and suddenly it was just obvious that it was obvious that our team was more skilled. Harlamov, Maltsev, Yakushev, all those people were like individually more skilled, whereas Canadians just relied upon just throwing the puck into the zone and then just everybody rushing there and just crashing everybody into the.
Mm.
And so, whereas Harlamov, just could single-handedly basically go around everyone there
Yeah.
and just
Yeah.
score. Yeah. So that was this kind of filigree kind of this very fine work and so forth. That was the hallmark of Soviet hockey school. But we didn't know that Canadians were not like that. We thought they were like that, but infinitely better still. Anyways, at some point in the third, and since we were starting doing shots when Soviets started scoring heavily,
Right.
and of course we got tremendously drunk, and we were drinking this vodka, so you just essentially, and I was not used to it. It was just I was a kid from a good Jewish family. I was not used to drinking vodka, let alone that kind of vodka that was not even anything sold in in Leningrad or in Moscow. That
Did
was
you
just
make it through the game?
well, no, we would constantly. You would run out and you would throw up, and then you would come back and you just watch. And we were drinking from this kind of warm, like dented aluminum cups. This kind of disgusting drink. And we were chasing it with like Soviet sausage, locally made, which is whatever. Not every most Canadian dogs would not eat that. No, and so yeah, at some point during third period, when it was kind of clear that, and there was jubilation all around me, suddenly I realized, much to my horror, that I was actually rooting for Canadians, and that was a piercing realization that completely devastated me, because how? When did I become enemy of the people? An anti-Soviet element. And I looked around me, and everybody was like hugging and so forth, and drinking and singing and whatever. I was just like, I'm like an enemy here. And so I tried to purge that thought from my mind, but it was already planted there. It was a horrifying thought, a horrifying moment. But since I just realized that somewhere, somehow along the lines of my life, I had crossed into the territory of being an anti-Soviet element, and that means enemy of the people, and that means that I need to be removed from the Soviet society. So that I think that was the irrevocable moment. Since then, I was an anti-Soviet element. Since then, but it still didn't. It took years and years, uh, to make a decision to become openly anti-Soviet element, to drop out, as it were, from the ordinary round of Soviet life.
Did you
Yeah,
feel very ashamed of that
I
feeling?
feel too. I felt extremely puzzled and horrified.
Mm.
Not really ashamed, but just but just start, what am I going to do now? Now I'm in reality I was simply rooting for the underdog and wanting to make the game more interesting. But in reality, I kind of, yeah, by that moment I had already kind of probably accumulated enough negative um, uh, energy against the Soviet Union somehow, which was my country, to somehow to manifest itself in that particular, you know.
Mm, yeah.
So that was a but the interesting thing, of course, is that that game took place, and everything was new to us. Of course, the organ playing, it was not at all, because there were no commercials, of course, in the Soviet Union, and no
Right.
no organ either. It was just the whole thing, and the fact that they were the Canadians, like they were without helmets, which is kind of bizarre, just and somebody like Guy Lafleur just Gillifleur or Esposito, just like demons, like flying all over the place with this hair, or
Mm,
Bobby Hall with no teeth, basically at all, or Bobby Clark rather. And so it was very, very impressive. But there was 300 kilometers northwest of Leningrad, in this kind of on the shore of some godforsaken river, in mud, and amid this vast space of Russia, somewhere in the country, on the outside of that village, watching this game taking place at the Montreal Forum, which is where I live now, like 10 minutes or 5 minute walk from the former Montreal Forum. So that's an interesting,
yeah, no kidding.
no kidding,
That
right?
must feel pretty surreal, I gotta say.
Yeah, at first it felt, but then what do you do with this?
Yeah.